Leon Panetta 2024 Lecture Series, 2024 and the Challenges to Democracy at Home and Abroad. This lecture discusses the challenge of war in the Middle East. Will there be peace or more war? Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Sylvia Panetta.
Good evening, everyone. It's so nice to see all of you. And it's with great pleasure that I welcome every one of you to the third event of this year's Leon Panetta Lecture Series live here in Leon's hometown of Monterey at the Monterey Conference Center. Thank you for being here. This evening, we continue the discussion of the challenges facing our democracy at home and abroad. Tonight, we turn to the threats to democracy in the world, from Putin's invasion of Ukraine to China's threats to Taiwan to the expanding nuclear threat from North Korea and Iran, and in particular now, the Israel-Hamas war in the Middle East. We are now 7 months into a brutal and destructive war that began with Hamas attacking Israel on October 7th, killing 1,200 Israeli citizens and capturing 200 hostages. In response, Israel invaded Gaza with the military goal of destroying Hamas. But this is an enemy that hides in tunnels, hospitals, and uses civilians as shields. The bombings and military operations by Israel have killed close to 35,000 Palestinians and resulted in a critical humanitarian crisis. There are continuing efforts by the U.S. and Arab nations to put a temporary ceasefire in place, but Hamas and Israel have yet to agree. So what is the future path of this war? Will Israel's attack on Rafah result in more innocent lives being lost? How can the U.S. balance the need for Israel to be able to defend itself, defeat Hamas, and yet protect the lives of Palestinians in Gaza? What possible future lies ahead for Gaza? Is a Palestinian state solution still possible? Is there a chance for any kind of ceasefire? Leon will pose these questions with foreign policy experts who understand the military, national security, and diplomatic issues involved in this historic conflict. Our first guest is a former diplomat, author, and advisor on foreign policy. She is the co-founder and partner, along with Condoleezza Rice, Stephen Hadley, and Robert Gates, in Rice, Hadley, Gates, and Manuel, a strategic consulting firm that helps U.S. companies navigate international markets. From 2005 to 2007, she served as an official at the U.S. Department of State, as Special Assistant to the Undersecretary for Political Affairs, Nicholas Burns, responsible for Asia policy. In 2017, she published the critically acclaimed book, This Brave New World, India, China, and the United States, which addresses the changing role of the United States alongside two emerging powers. Today, she is the executive director of the Aspen Strategy Group and Aspen Security Forum, a premier bipartisan forum on foreign policy in the United States. Please welcome Anya Manuel. Our second guest served as the U.S. ambassador to Israel from 2021 to 2023. Appointed by President Barack Obama, he served as Deputy Secretary of State and Chief Operating Officer of the U.S. State Department. He was awarded the nation's highest diplomatic honor by Secretary of State Hillary Rodham Clinton for his service. Prior to his time in Israel, he spent nearly a decade at Morgan Stanley as Chief Operating Officer, Managing Director, and Vice Chairman. He serves on the boards of the Partnership for Public Service, the International Rescue Committee, the Atlantic Council, and the Urban Alliance Foundation. So please welcome Ambassador Tom Knights. Our third guest played a leading role in shaping U.S. involvement in the Middle East peace process, dealing directly with the parties as the U.S. point man on the peace process in both the George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton administrations. He served as Special Assistant to President Obama and National Security Council Senior Director for the Central Region, spending the first 6 months of the administration as the Special Advisor on Iran to Secretary of State Hillary Rodham Clinton. A highly skilled diplomat, he was instrumental in assisting Israelis and Palestinians to reach the 1995 interim agreement. He also successfully brokered the 1997 Hebron Accord, facilitated the 1994 Israeli-Jordan Peace Treaty, and intensively worked to bring Israel and Syria together. Prior to his service in the Clinton administration, Ambassador Ross served as director of the State Department's policy planning staff in the first Bush administration. He played a prominent role in arms control negotiations and the 1991 Gulf War Coalition. Please welcome Ambassador Dennis Ross. Our fourth guest had a 40-year active duty career in the U.S. Air Force as the Supreme Allied Commander, Europe, and Commander of the U.S. European Command. In these positions, he led Europe's transition out of Afghanistan, ensured the COVID health crisis did not transform into a security crisis, and led NATO's military allies and partners through the largest invasion of a European nation since World War II. Prior to his leadership position at NATO, he served as the commander of U.S. Air Forces Europe, Commander of U.S. Air Forces Africa, Commander of NATO Allied Air Command, and Director of Joint Air Power Competence Center. He also served as the Director of Operations of the U.S. Joint Staff, Director of Operations of the U.S. Air Force, Commander of the 12th Air Force Air Component Command, U.S. Southern Command, as well as several more key command positions. Please welcome General Todd Walters. Moderating our discussion is the man who created this lecture series, the former United States representative for this district and the former director of the CIA and Secretary of Defense. He understands how volatile this region is and how essential peace in the Middle East is to our own national security. So please welcome Secretary Leon Panetta.
Thank you, and good evening. This is our third forum of the Panetta Lecture Series for 2024. And as all of you know, the overall theme is one focused on the challenges to our democracy, both at home and abroad. The first two lectures focused on the challenges here at home, artificial intelligence and immigration. And tonight, we turn to the challenge to democracy in the world. And there are a number of those challenges. From a terrorist attack to a democracy in the Middle East, to Putin invading a sovereign democracy in Ukraine, to the threats from Xi and China against the democracy in Taiwan, from nuclear threats from Kim Jong-un in North Korea, and from the supreme leader in Iran. A lot of flashpoints, more flashpoints than I think we've seen since World War II. And in particular, we focus on a violent and destructive war between Israel and Hamas that has created divisions here at home and abroad. I think it's important to remind people that the basic purpose of these lectures that have been going on for well over 20 years now, the basic point is not to choose sides, but to educate and to inform and to make sure that people understand the issues, the complex issues that are involved, so that people, you the people, can decide ultimately what is right. The Middle East has been a cauldron of war going back to 1948. There are over a dozen or more wars that have taken place during that period. Some presidents tried to find a path to peace. Others failed or didn't even want to get involved. But failure is not an option when countless lives are at stake. So what is the path to resolving this conflict? Is there still a chance for some kind of ceasefire? Can we end the long history, ugly history, of hate and intolerance? Or will war continue to repeat itself time and time again? These are tough questions and not easy answers. But I'm very privileged to have this very distinguished panel of experts try to handle some of the issues involved that we're going to discuss tonight. Let me begin with the question of the moment. How the hell does this war end? There are a lot of currents that are involved right now with regards to the war. Israel has made clear that it will move ahead to defeat the remaining battalions of Hamas in Rafah. There are 1 million refugees who are there, whose lives are at risk. President Biden has threatened to limit the supply of weapons if Israel does not limit its operation and protect innocent lives. We just got a report from the State Department that implies that Israel has not always complied with the conditions of these weapons. There are still efforts at trying to find some kind of ceasefire. It's not clear what's going to happen once this war does come to an end. What's going to happen in Gaza? Is there going to be a Palestinian state? A A lot of questions. So what is the path forward? Can this war be brought to an end? Is peace possible, or are we simply going to repeat the cycle of war? Let me ask somebody to begin who's had a lot of experience in that part of the world. Dennis, let me ask you.
Thank you. First, Secretary Panetta, let me thank you for creating this kind of a forum. I think what you said in introducing this is, quite essential these days when we have a tendency to look at all issues in a polarized way. We tend to shout at each other and never listen to each other. And as someone who spent a lot of time as a mediator, the one attribute I can tell you a mediator has to have, you have to be a good listener. So let me start with maybe two different sets of observations. One would be when the larger question you're asking is, can peace ever be possible? When it comes to Israelis and Palestinians, I think one of the first principles that needs to be understood is that you have two national movements competing for the same space. These are two national identities. They're not going to coexist in one state. When you look at the Middle East, the one thing you see is wherever there's more than one identity, national, tribal, sectarian, that's a state either that is at war with itself or completely paralyzed. So if you want a future of hope for Arabs and Israelis, but specifically for Israelis and Palestinians, you need two states. They will simply not coexist in one state. So that's sort of point one. Point two, the idea that we can go from where we are to an outcome with two states is also an illusion, because we have now two societies that are completely traumatized. In the case of the Israelis, every Israeli has been touched by this war. Every Israeli, in a sense, has lost their sense of security. People don't make peace when they lack a sense of security. But Palestinians have also been traumatized because of the effects of what's gone on in Gaza. When you have someone suffering from trauma, they are consumed by their own pain. They have no capacity to think about the other side's pain, and so long as that's the case, making concessions to the other side will be very difficult. So that's kind of the context in which we have to approach this. The point about can this war end, the answer is this war will end at some point. The question is, can it be ended sooner rather than later? I think the key to that is starting with a premise. One thing the Biden administration accepted from the beginning is Hamas can never again create the kind of threat that it did to Israel on October 7th. Now the question is, what produces that kind of an outcome? When I hear the Prime Minister of Israel talk about total victory, that's a slogan. It's not an objective. There is no such thing as total victory. You cannot eradicate an ideology. Ideas don't disappear. They can be discredited, but never by people on the outside. So you're not going to eradicate Hamas, but you can demilitarize Gaza. And Israel's not that far from being able to demilitarize Gaza. I would like to see the Biden administration focus on getting a common definition of how much is enough for demilitarization, have the Israelis then ask the question or get a commitment on the mechanisms that would be put in place to ensure there can't be a remilitarization of Gaza. If we can get to that point, we can end the war. In answer to your question about what comes next, there will have to be an alternative to Hamas. It will have to be a Palestinian alternative to Hamas. There probably can be some kind of interim arrangement where you bring in a combination of Arab states, maybe under some kind of regional or international umbrella, on an interim basis to hand off at some point to a reformed Palestinian Authority, which exists in the West Bank. And that can be the basis in which creating a Palestinian alternative form of governance within Gaza. Once you have a potential to politically reunify Gaza and the West Bank. You can't talk about a Palestinian state when there's a division between Gaza and the West Bank between two different Palestinian entities. So you recreate a kind of political unity there, then at least you have a basis. And then I would say if you want to move towards a political outcome, you have to start in a very practical, low-key way. You have to reestablish the idea of cooperation as a fact between Israelis and Palestinians. One last point, and I'll just stop with this. What's interesting is if you go back to the beginning of COVID, there was a resistance on the part of the Palestinian Authority to accept any help from the Israelis. And you know what happened? the health officials and people from Sheba Hospital simply went ahead and shared the vaccines and all sorts of masks and tests. And the Palestinians who were in the health ministry there ignored the political leadership and accepted it. If we can remind people and then demonstrate again that Israelis and Palestinians can engage in functional cooperation, we can begin a baseline to again begin thinking about moving politically.
Great. Tom, you've been ambassador there to Israel. What are your thoughts? How does this come to an end?
Well, first of all, I want to say, and I'm honored to be here, and for Sylvia and you to do this is an honor for all of us. But I have a little bit of a man crush on Leon. I was 26 years old, and I met then Congressman Panetta on Capitol Hill, and he is what you want to be. Okay, here's a guy who was tremendously successful as a member of Congress, and a really nice guy. Okay, and a really nice guy. Everyone loved Leon Panetta. And he went from there to head of OMB, to chief of staff, the head of the CIA, and the head of the Defense Department, and he hasn't changed one bit, so thank you very much. Okay. There's nothing that Dennis said that obviously I don't agree with. I think it is important for you all to understand, and I say this to my friends who are demonstrating at college campuses and even my own kids. I try to explain to them and try to get them to understand the trauma that the city of Israel is going through in a way that I don't think anyone really understood until if you were there and lived there. Dennis has got a home there. Obviously, I spent an enormous amount of time. His kids live there. The place will never be the same. I think people don't forget. It would be as if 350 million Americans knew someone who died in the Twin Towers. It's that significant. Okay, every single Israeli. I have multiple of my friends who lost their kids at the concert the day of October 7th, were kidnapped. There was, the barbaric nature of what Hamas did of taking grandmas and grandfathers and kids and babies and dragging them into Gaza. So Israel has, multiple things that they got to do. The first thing is they've obviously got to get the hostages back, and that has become an enormous difficulty on behalf of the government. Second, as Dennis mentioned, they have to rid the place of Hamas. Now, we'll talk about in this forum about what ridding that really means as an ideology, but the military ability for Hamas needs to be destroyed. And third, Israel needs to do a better job in making sure that innocent Palestinians do not either lose their lives and are fed appropriately. You have a humanity issue that we need to do a better job of accomplishing, because wars are difficult. And we got here because of what Hamas did, but that doesn't mean that this fight is not with the Palestinian people. This fight is with Hamas and Israel and America, and the pressure that we put on the Israeli government is the sole purpose of supporting this government to rid Gaza of Hamas, but also put pressure on the Bibi's and his government to make sure that they're feeding the humanitarian crisis, which quite frankly, I don't think they've done a good enough job as they should have done, and they need to put pressure. So you have to understand that as a foundational issue as you figure out how to get out of this. And as Dennis pointed out, many of us have a mutual friend, a guy named Rahm Emanuel, who's now the ambassador to Japan, was the mayor of Chicago and chief of staff. Very tough guy. And he always say, he stole this line from Winston Churchill, and he says, don't let a good crisis go to waste. This is one hell of a crisis. And out of this crisis, I think it's imperative that all of us understand that we could be sitting here a year from now, or a year and a half, with a different Middle East. Because I do believe that, one, we will get these hostages out. I do believe we'll destroy Hamas. And I believe for potentially the first time, the Arab countries, for the first time, may actually engage themselves with the PA and attempt to try to govern Gaza in a new way. And it may be, and inclusive of that, potentially a Saudi normalization with Israel. I think we could be here in a place, I know it's hard to imagine with all the stuff that's going on and all the craziness and all the bloodshed and all the tears, but I'm hopeful that in a period of time, not in the way future, that we could have potentially a new Middle East that comes out of this.
Great. Thank you. Thank you for having me, Secretary Panetta, and thank you to all of you for caring so deeply about these issues, dedicating your lives to diplomacy and to military service, because that's what it's going to take to get to peace here. I would add 2 points to the great points that have already been made. 1, absolutely there will be peace. 2, getting there depends on politics and not necessarily policy, and so it may not happen in a time frame that's comfortable for all of us. So let me start with why I'm so optimistic that we'll get there. Frankly, one of the things that's made me optimistic is this afternoon. So we had a session like this with 100 young people who came from all sides of the political spectrum, who asked us very tough, insightful questions, and who want to eventually do public service. Now we see all of you, people of goodwill, sitting here wanting to learn about the nuances of this conflict, and you have a few people outside expressing their right to freedom of speech and doing it peacefully, and that is great. That's exactly what we should be doing. Eventually, history, the arc of history moves towards the positive. It may not feel like that right now. I come from the part of Western Germany that was right on the border with the East. So if you hiked too far from my home village, you ended up in a minefield. And that was a conflict that wasn't resolved for 4.5 decades. It was managed. And it meant that people weren't dying. And sometimes in foreign policy, it's not what presidents like to brag about on the campaign trail, but sometimes that's the best you can do. And so I think right now we're in a state where everybody, the Biden administration, people of goodwill, Palestinians, Israelis, Palestinians clearly not served well by their Hamas leadership. I would also argue that the Israelis may not be served so well by Netanyahu's leadership. But there are people on both sides of this that want to return back to allowing people to be safe and healthy and to feed their children. And so eventually, maybe through the mechanism that you listed, Dennis, maybe it'll take longer than we hope. Maybe it'll take an election in Israel. It'll take Hamas actually being ejected from there, but we will get there. Thank you.
Todd, what do you think?
Well, first of all, Secretary Panetta, I want to thank you and Sylvia for the tremendous hospitality. I first met Secretary Panetta over 30 years ago, and he was all alone with respect to his tremendous leadership qualities. And the one thing that I've noticed over the course of the last several hours is he married way up. Well done. Well done. He's a smart man in every category. Well, I'm aligned with all the comments that have been presented, and I think we can all see that from October 7th to April 17th, the twists and turns that have taken place in this conflict, all above the national level, all above the regional level, and all impacting activities across the globe. And in military circles, what we attempt to do to prevent that is work with the government to craft an extremely comprehensive plan that addresses as many activities as you can possibly imagine and looks for solutions in each one of those activities. And it's very obvious, given what is taking place with respect to the myopic approach that the IDF wanted to take with respect to Hamas that has blossomed into these global repercussions. Our planning has a lot of work ahead of us. And I think until we can get to the point to where we can establish what it is the end state should be, what the conditions on the ground and the conditions in the region should be, and articulate that to the citizens that are impacted by these activities, we're going to be in a better spot once we can do that. But we're still remiss on those activities, and it's something, Secretary Panetta, that you're very familiar with from your time as our Secretary of Defense, that I still think we've got a lot of work out in front of us to get done.
Yeah. Let me ask you, Tom, Israel obviously focuses a great deal on security and making sure that what happened would not happen. And yet, something terrible happened. They were caught totally unprepared and not ready to deal with this attack that took place. Why did that happen? Why did that happen? Was it failed intelligence? Was it that their attention was diverted, dealing with settlements, dealing with how to limit the Supreme Court, fighting over that? Did they take things for granted? Tom, what was the failure here?
Well, as you know, as the former head of the CIA, intelligence is only as good as in your preconceived notions of it. Okay, we all have biases. As soon as a head of the CIA and a head of defense, you have biases that come. Most of them are good, but you have like life history that guides you, and you get information all the time, and you look at the information, you read the information, but you have a presumption of what you think is the real answer, even though information is coming. I think it is, again, the good news about the Jews is that they're very good at self-examination. There'll be an enormous amount of focus, as it was after the Yom Kippur War. They will examine every piece of this and who did what and how did it happen, where they did it, and they will learn from it. But I think this is a case, in my humble view, and I would be curious what Dennis's view and the other ones, other folks in this panel, but I think Israel was simply believed that Hamas wouldn't be this stupid. That they fundamentally, and I'm serious about this, remember 15,000 Gazans were working in Israel every day, okay? Every day. There was money flowing from Qatar to Egypt into Gaza, which Israel was pretty aware of, okay? There was lots of eyes in and ears on and all the things you do in security. But I think fundamentally, I think that the Israelis believed that they knew that if they did something of this magnitude, that the repercussions would be unbelievable and that they wouldn't do it. Because remember, even when I was as ambassador, we had multiple rocket launches back and forth from Gaza into Israel, and then we would bomb the crap out of them, and they would send a few more bits, and then they would hit them again, and then it would end. It would be 2-3 weeks, and we'd just shuttle diplomacy and calm everything, but it was ended. So I think fundamentally, they made a miscalculation. Hamas doesn't care about the Palestinian people.
Right.
That was the miscalculation. If 30 or 40 or 50 or 100,000 Palestinians die, Hamas's view, that's for martyrism, because their objective is not for a two-state solution, which I support, and Dennis supports, and Joe Biden supports, and many people support. Their objective is no, the objective is to have one state, and that doesn't include Israel. Their objective of Hamas is to destroy the state of Israel. And if a lot of people have to die for it to happen, that is just the cause. And so I think what people need to recognize, remember, Hamas's leadership is hanging out in the tunnels where all the people are either starving or living in shambles, and they're all living in tunnels. They're not letting the Gazans come hang out with them in the tunnels. So I think it's imperative for everyone to understand. So I think this is a fundamental miscalculation, without question a security failure, but a miscalculation that in fact Hamas actually wanted this reaction, and that this reaction would create an international uproar, which it has, and they have been quite successful in accomplishing what they were out to do.
You mentioned Netanyahu. How much is Netanyahu responsible for what happened on that day? And is it going to cost him his job?
The first question is very tough. You can never, you have been at the highest levels of political administrations. How much one person is responsible, unclear. Look, there were hundreds of thousands of Israelis in the streets protesting Netanyahu before this all happened. He is a political survivor. Everyone on this panel has dealt with him personally. He is a wily, excellent politician. And I think his incentives now are mismatched in my personal view, with those of the Israeli people. Because for Netanyahu, it's important to have a big heroic win so he can try to stay in power. If he loses power, he might be prosecuted. There are all sorts of things nipping at his heels. If he stays in power, who knows how much longer this goes on, but we were all talking behind the scenes, what happens next in Israeli politics? And I think people can imagine how the Netanyahu government falls, but no one can quite imagine how something more centrist is reconstituted quickly. And I think that's the dilemma we're in front of now.
I mean, I do think, I will say one thing. Israel is a democracy. The Israeli people will decide who their leader is. And I have an enormous amount of confidence the Israeli people will come out of this and try to determine what their new leadership looks like. And as a guy who was there, I had 3 prime ministers in my 2+ years there, they're a very active democracy. And I'm confident they will, after this war is over, that they will step back and look at the leadership and make determination who should lead this country.
There will be a political reckoning in Israel.
There will.
October 7th was the worst day in Israel's history by far.
That's right.
You will have a series of resignations that will be made by all the senior military and intelligence people. And when many of them go, and they will go probably by the summer, is my guess, some of them for sure will say, we bear the responsibility for what happened. It's on us and we'll live with it for the rest of our lives. But we were following the Prime Minister's policy. I'll tell you, the last meeting I had with, not the current head of Shin Bet, but the previous head of Shin Bet, a guy named Nadav Agraman, one of the things he told me in the very last meeting, he was going to be leaving in 1 week, he said, we are making a strategic mistake. This was, in probably 2021. He said, we are making a strategic mistake. We are building up Hamas as an alternative to the Palestinian Authority. And it's going to come back and it's going to cost us in a big way. Now, he will testify before the State Inquiry Commission, which there will be. And it'll be very clear who he will hold responsible. So there will be, because Israel's a democracy, there will be a reckoning, a political reckoning. And there will be a change in Israel. And it may be, we'll see a stage, a transition. The initial, I think, change will produce a broad-based government that will be basically centrist. But it'll have left and right in it. You'll have an Arab party in it, and you'll have parties on the right in it. But this will come, and there will be something else that will have to come in Israel. There will have to be a real debate about what the relationship with Palestinians should be. The irony is there's actually never been a real debate about that. The Oslo process that I ended up playing a major role in, Yitzhak Rabin made a decision. He won in the Knesset 61-59. There wasn't a debate, there was opposition. There was a decision that was made. When Ariel Sharon withdrew from Gaza 100%, all the settlements, all the soldiers, he made a decision. There was opposition to it, but the opposition didn't say, well, we have a better way. Just like those who were against Oslo, they didn't offer a better way. They were just against this. There will be a political debate and there will be soul-searching in Israel. There will need to be soul-searching among Palestinians as well, which, by the way, there has never been soul-searching among Palestinians. Israelis have a structure in which to do it. The problem for Palestinians is they haven't had that structure, but they need it, and they've also been failed by their leaders.
Yeah. Todd, you're a military guy. How do you define victory here? Because Netanyahu said that the objective is to destroy Hamas. We know that it's a near impossible goal because it's like trying to destroy Al-Qaeda. Hamas will always be there, but you can obviously target the leadership of Hamas, those involved in the attack. But even there, he's going to go through Rafah. He might get rid of these 4 battalions, but he's not going to get all the leadership of Hamas. They're not going to wait around. And so it may take years before they complete the effort to try to go after the leadership. So what constitutes victory here?
Well, Secretary, for us in the military, I think that's the key question. The articulation of the activities surrounding Israel, the Israeli Defense Force, finding ways to neutralize Hamas in the near, medium, and far, and what conditions on the ground and in the environment will look like once this task is completed. Those sets of plans need to be put in place. And as you know from your practice, anybody that submits a mission statement to the Secretary of Defense of the United States that says defeat anybody is going to have a hard time explaining to you what the definition of defeat is. And so usually we step back from that just a little bit and define what it is we want the end state to be as far as the relationships are and the conditions on the ground. And until we can put that kind of thinking in place with our Israeli friends, and until we can put an architecture in place that supports that cause, I think this conflict is later rather than sooner. I note what took place during your time as our Secretary of Defense as we looked to bring down ISIS and bring down Al-Qaeda. We knew that this was probably going to be a lifetime journey, and when that plan was crafted, it discussed the branches and sequels that extended across planet Earth and the architecture that was going to be required to make gains in that activity. And we still haven't seen that yet from a comprehensive standpoint on behalf of the Israelis. And I think that's something that puts us in a better direction. But this journey to neutralize Hamas takes a lot of brain power. Words actually matter. They need to be very precise. And obviously the activities on the ground is one that begs complete precision 100% of the time, or you have the terrible loss of innocent life.
Dennis, how's Netanyahu going to ultimately bring this war to an end? If they go through Rafah, is he going to say, that's it, we've done our job? I mean, give me a sense of how he'll present this.
It's interesting because up until now, he has continued to talk about total victory, which I said earlier, that's a slogan, not an objective. But he is emphasizing Rafah right now, and I don't think it's simply because he's been talking about it for a couple of months. If you look carefully at what he's saying, he's suddenly talking about Rafah in a way that implies once we've done this, then we've effectively dealt with the Hamas military. Now, he hasn't quite said once we've done that, we're in a position to end the war, and I still don't know how that relates to what his political needs of the coalition will be. If he decides that ending the war at that point isn't going to satisfy the far right of his coalition, then he has to make a hard decision. And will they stay in the government? Will they bring the government down? At some point, this has always been the case for Bibi, he's going to have to make a choice. I've been saying for some time, and I will tell you, his whole career has been shaped by avoiding choice. Yeah. Now he's in a position where he doesn't have the maneuver he used to have. And I've been saying for a while, Bibi at some point is going to have to choose between Biden or Ben-Gvir. I know what his choice should be.
All right. Let me ask the question about kind of the difference between an invasion force and a more limited, targeted effort to go after the Hamas. Obviously, when 9/11 happened, 3,000 people were killed. We declared war on Al-Qaeda, but Al-Qaeda disappeared into the tribal area in Pakistan. Pakistan said, the United States is not going to bring boots on the ground. They're not going to use F-16s. And so we developed basically a counterterrorism approach to going after those targets. And it took time, took 10 years. But we ultimately got most of the leadership of Al-Qaeda, including bin Laden. Israel approaches this, and I understand it's a different situation. You got people in tunnels and in schools and mosques, et cetera. But the United States has been saying, can you use a more targeted approach? Right. Can you go into Rafah and use a more targeted approach? Why can't Israel use a more targeted approach to dealing with these targets?
Well, this has been the whole Biden, listen, this is not a political comment, so this is a nonpartisan event, so I want to be clear about this, but I don't think there's been a president, in my humble view, since Harry Truman that's done actually more for the state of Israel than Joe Biden has, okay? At an enormous political cost. When he came to Israel for the 10th time when I was ambassador, he stood up and said, listen, there's an unbreakable bond between our two countries, and he meant it. He showed up there, 5 days after October 7th, when the Hezbollah were deciding that they were going to potentially attack Israel. He sent 2 massive ships to the Mediterranean. 4 weeks ago, when Iran shot 380 rockets or 340 rockets into Israel, it was the United States. We sent our head of Central Command to Israel to manage the coordination. As you can see, not only did Israel shoot those rockets down, and the United States, and a bunch of our Middle East partners, which was for the first time actually actively done it, and that was done by the coordination. But the one thing, or 2 things the president has been very clear on. One is we need to expand our humanitarian issues in Gaza. We can't watch people being starved. And second, if you're going to go into Rafah, have a plan. Have a plan. You can't take 1.5 million people and move them somewhere where you know where to move and then drop a bunch of bombs on them. It doesn't work that way. So, and by the way, the president has not said that the activity they did at the Rafah bridge was, he didn't question that. What he's questioned is, if you're going to go into Rafah, into the city of Rafah, you need to move these people, but you need to move them somewhere. We're not going to be a party of you dropping 2,000-pound bombs on tens of thousands of people. So what your question is, what the administration has been doing and trying to do and working with the Israelis to come up with a systematic plan, because we don't have any issue of if they have to go into Rafah and believe that there's 3 brigades or 4 brigades. I don't know, Shinwar is there or he's somewhere else. But the question, you've got to do it in a methodical way. And General knows better than I do, and you certainly know better than I do, and how to do that. But you got to do it in a very thoughtful way. That is what our position's been.
Can I just add
one point?
Anya?
Yeah.
Yeah.
The United States did something very important after 9/11. The first thing we did was say, Taliban leaders of Afghanistan at the time, turn over Osama bin Laden and al-Qaeda and you will not be invaded. Israel never did anything similar. And I think Israel is completely justified to defend itself, to fight back against the worst terrorist attack, something that is so fundamental to feeling secure in their own state. But they have lost so much of the public, including the American public, and certainly the public in the Middle East, by never making this about Hamas and saying, okay, you don't want us to go into Rafah? Why don't you come out of the tunnels and fight? Why are you such cowards? You, Hamas, are putting the Palestinians in danger. You, Hamas, are the reason that 80% of the infrastructure in northern Gaza has been destroyed. You're hiding under schools. You're hiding under hospitals. You're hiding in mosques. And I don't think that message has been made clearly enough. Certainly not, it's not what the Middle East is hearing. When I'm in the Gulf Arab states, they're hearing the opposite of that. And I think it's not what our students on college campuses are hearing, and it bears repeating.
Yeah, I would add, I'd add sort of 2 points. Part of the problem is I think the Israelis have made that point, but nobody's listening to what they're saying. So that's a point that we collectively should be organizing that. We should be constantly repeating, why are hostages being held? Why doesn't the Hamas leadership decide to save the Palestinians in Gaza by leaving Gaza? That, by the way, would end the war. Ending the war is not just about the Israelis, it's also about Hamas. So part of this has to be reframing the issues, and not just the Israelis, because I read what they put out every day, and they say a lot of this, but it gets, nobody pays attention to it. And in the Gulf states, because they see the images coming out of Gaza, that's all they focus on. So if we're not framing the issue in terms of Hamas could end this yesterday, if the leaders would leave, Hamas is continuing to put the lives of Palestinians at risk. And we would like to see some sign they care about the people of Gaza. So it isn't, yes, there are things Israel has to do for sure, and they haven't done what they needed to do. What Tom is saying about on the humanitarian side, they have not done what they needed to do. One other point I'll just make. We can talk a lot about the impact 9/11 had on us, and it's a way of sort of relating to Israel, but there is one big difference, not only in terms of the numbers. This is right next door to Israel. You know, we were attacked from a long ways away. We went into Afghanistan. This is right next door to Israel. There are 150,000 Israelis who are still not living in their homes. So there's a part of the reason you have the sense of shock in Israel, the sense of trauma. It's not just that everybody knows somebody, but you still have 150,000 people who are not living in their homes.
All right, we've reached the halfway point, and what I want to do is recognize our question review team, the people responsible for selecting the questions that will be presented in the second half of the show. Please hold your applause while I introduce the entire group. They are Mike Clancy, who's a reporter with KSQD, FM 90.7. David Kellogg, managing editor of the Monterey Herald. Pam Marino, who's reporter of the Monterey County Weekly. And Doug McKnight, who's a reporter with KAZU Radio. Would you please give them a hand? And Sylvia and I also want to thank the Panetta Institute Board of Directors and the lecture series sponsors that make these programs possible and allow us to share these important discussions with all of you, our audience, watching at home, and also with students from across Central and Northern California. We had a great student program. They asked some great questions. It's important for them to understand what's involved with this issue. So please give our sponsors a hand, too. All right, let's turn to their questions. Does President Biden's decision to pause weapon shipments to Israel represent a fundamental and lasting change in the relationship between the U.S. and Israel?
No.
Absolutely not. I mean, it's so far from, again, 97, 98, 99% of the weapon systems that Israel wants, they're receiving and will continue to receive. I don't, the idea that somehow, again, I repeated this before about what's going on in Rafah, and I'm not going to repeat it again, but the reality of this is the president is focused on making sure that Hamas is defeated. Most importantly, he is in his gut, in his kishkas, those of you who might understand a little bit of Yiddish, in his kishkas, he believes in the importance of the state of Israel. He'll say, if Israel didn't exist, it would have to be invented, okay? It would have to be invented because this is how this guy thinks about this place, okay? But just like anyone who has a close relationship with a relative, sometimes you can also have tough conversations with your relatives and still love them, okay? So ultimately, this decision, even this pause for one particular weapon in one particular area has no indication or any implications about the support of the United States for the state of Israel.
I would even add, just to put it in perspective, a little more than 2 months ago, the Prime Minister of Israel promised the President that he would provide a credible evacuation plan before Israel would move into Rafah. Now, the President of the United States is still waiting for that plan, for him to act on that promise. So what happens is, sooner or later, you're going to have a president who's going to decide, okay, I need to see some performance on that promise. And I think what we saw was the statement he made. I will say, personally, I wasn't in favor of it because I think I understand why the president may have done it. I'm a little worried that if Hamas thinks that there's a major gap between the United States and Israel, and if we're putting a lot of pressure on Israel, that maybe they think the pressure is likely to be less applied by the Israelis to them. I think we want to see a hostage deal. They have to continue to feel that the pressure is going to go up, not down. I think Sinwar in particular has to feel the noose is tightening so that he has an interest in getting a reprieve. But having said that, I understand why the president did what he did.
Okay, let me ask Anya to comment on this. It's now been over 7 months since the October 7th attack, and the Israel-Hamas war has not yet widened into a regional conflict.
Yeah.
Will that continue to hold? Obviously, we saw what Iran did with the missiles. We see Hezbollah attacks. We see other proxy attacks. Is that going to hold? Can we avoid escalation
Yeah.
in this war?
Boy, this is the most important question. I'm glad somebody asked it. It's holding, but boy, is it precarious. So when Iran launched a direct attack on Israel, 300 drones, missiles, projectiles, that was changing the game. There had been a shadow war, as many of you know, between Iran and Israel, between proxies for years. Everyone sort of knew the rules of the game. People would sort of notify them of what's doing. I think what's happening is in Iran, you have a regime, and this doesn't get a lot of play on the news here in the US, you have a regime in Iran that's under a lot of pressure. The supreme leader is 85 years old. They just had elections, lowest turnout in decades. They have internal issues. They had huge protests a year ago. So this is a regime that feels under pressure from its right wing. And you have a regime in Israel that's under pressure from its right wing. So I think for now, we can be happy that things have calmed down between Iran and Israel. Hezbollah, and I'd love to hear what the other panelists say on this, Hezbollah has been a little bit hesitant to get into this fight because frankly, they have a good thing going. They're pretty corrupt. They have a pretty good position inside of Lebanon. They're probably doing some drug deals. And so they have been a little bit hesitant to go all in here. And Iran is hesitant to expend Hezbollah because it's the crown jewel of the proxies. Now, let me zoom out a little bit more because we haven't talked about the broader region at all. And that is, if you look at the Gulf Arab states, Tom, you were just there, I was just there, you have a real split screen. You have the Sunni kingdoms, the Saudi Arabia, UAE in particular, Qatar, Kuwait, Bahrain, they just want this war to go away. All they care about is economic growth. When I'm there, all they want to talk about is tech investment. How can we get California tech companies there as quickly as possible? By the way, that's one of the major reasons for the Abraham Accords. Everyone's like, hey, can those Israeli great tech companies now invest here? They want to talk about AI. They don't want this to be going on. So they don't have a stake in expanding it. Then you look at Egypt, Jordan, Lebanon, these countries that have been hugely hit by this, whose economies are enormously suffering. If you look at Egypt, has lost 40% of its revenue of what's coming through the Suez Canal. So they want it to end. So I think there's a lot of pressure in the region for it to be, if not ended, contained. But I'd be interested to hear your thoughts.
Look, Hezbollah, if they wanted this to be a war that was an all-out war, it would have happened.
What happened already?
So it hasn't happened because they want to keep it contained. The problem when you signal with force is you can hit the wrong target. And even if you don't intend it, you can end up with an escalation. Nasrallah made a speech today. This is the head of Hezbollah in Lebanon. He made a speech today in which he basically said things will continue along the border the way they have so long as the war in Gaza continues. So he's not walking away from continuing to engage in what is a daily, basically an exchange of fire every day between Israel and Hezbollah. And they've lost a couple hundred people, a couple hundred of their commandos, but the Israelis also don't have anybody living in the north now. And two of the places that were important towns along the border have been largely destroyed on the Israeli side. Kiryat Shmona is basically largely destroyed. Metula has largely been destroyed. So this is something that is containable because nobody wants it to escalate. But the reality, as I said, is you may not want it to escalate. You hit the wrong target and you may get it anyway.
Todd, is Israel playing into the hands of Hamas by pursuing a brutal campaign in Gaza, which is turning the world against Israel?
It certainly is in the information environment, and I would contend that Israel has to spend every waking second ensuring that they have a precise approach to every activity that is focused solely on the neutralization of Hamas. And anything that impacts the humanitarian environment that is not taken care of to the degree that it should be and causes unnecessary loss of life puts us in another position to where we start to have that mission creep and we start to get outside of the window of the purpose of the conflict itself. I think the myopic, precise approach of the Israeli forces to neutralize Hamas and to grow in their understanding of the humanitarian factors that are involved with this and the global factors that are involved with this should allow us to continue to be in a position to where we can keep this contained. It is certainly doable. Precision munitions are there. 21st century technology puts us in a position to where we have ways to make sure that we can be precise. We also have ways to do that and simultaneously communicate that to the citizens of our nations. And I just think in the information environment, as you well know, he or she who gets to the bully pulpit first, regardless of what they say being true or false, puts himself in an advantageous position. And there is a lot more that we can do in the information environment in this particular area to come out on a winning side for Israel.
Yeah.
Can I add one point? Todd, since you raised the information environment, I'm grateful to the reputable news organizations who are here covering this and a conversation that's complex and nuanced and actually covering the whole thing. 2, the information environment in the world is now completely adulterated. My focus mostly is on China and East Asia. When you look at how much is happening through Chinese and Russian misinformation, disinformation, bots, it is extreme. And so when you see the information environment in the Middle East, but also across the global South, across Africa and Latin America, they're hearing a pretty pro-Palestinian and even a pro-Hamas message, frankly, because it helps the Chinese and the Russians for things to be anti-Israel and anti-the US. So always take it with a grain of salt. There is the bully pulpit, but these days there's also so much disinformation that just better check 3 times what you're listening to. Yeah. Listen to Secretary Panetta.
Dennis, you've been working with this a long time. Is the two-state solution the path to peace in the Middle East? And how do you get there if you can't convince Netanyahu that it's the answer?
You know, what you were saying earlier today, you were quoting Churchill on democracy. It's the worst of all possible political way of organizing except for everything else. The reality is there is no alternative to a two-state outcome. Not because I've worked for it for a long time. If I thought there was a way to produce a one-state outcome that would be enduring, I would have a different attitude. I said it earlier, you have 2 separate national identities. You have 2 separate national movements. They will not coexist in one state. I actually had a leading member of Fatah. I brought him to Washington years ago, and he was actually a member of what was known as the Tanzim. These were the young Fatah activists. And he explained, look, why had he come to accept 2 states? Because he said in one state, either we will try to dominate them or they will try to dominate us. Right. So it's not like we have an alternative that can work. You're going to have 2 states for 2 peoples. Now, getting there is clearly a problem because the attitudes on both sides right now will be very difficult to change. In the case of Prime Minister Netanyahu, if you ask me, could he accept a 2-state outcome? In 2009, he made a speech where he did. Now, he has a very different government today. With this government, could he accept a 2-state outcome? The answer is no, not a chance. Is he willing to move down that path? If the Biden administration were to succeed in its effort to produce a breakthrough between Saudi Arabia and Israel, there is an element of that. The Saudis will say, we can only do this. We get a defense treaty from you, we get a nuclear civil partnership from you, but we need you to deliver from the Israelis a commitment on a pathway to a Palestinian state that we regard as being credible. Now, if the administration goes to Netanyahu and lays out, here's what it takes, will he make that decision? You know, can I say to you that I know he won't? I can tell you right now, his legacy is going to be October 7th. If he has an alternative where his legacy could be, you transform the Middle East, you take, the King of Saudi Arabia is the custodian of the two holy mosques, the most important Sunni-led country. You are in effect actually taking also a religious element out of the conflict. I will tell you, as a negotiator forever, I always tried to deny there was a religious element to the conflict. Because if there's a religious element, you can't solve it. But here, you're actually removing what I've always known, at least in a subliminal way, is there. And so, will he make that choice? I don't know. I don't know. But I think it's worth presenting him that choice. The challenge will be the Saudis want to show they're achieving something for the Palestinians that's never been achieved before, and they want something that creates a kind of automaticity when it comes to a Palestinian state. The problem is, an automaticity means, well, that state could be led by Hamas. Well, that state could be an ally of Iran. So you have to come up with what would be some benchmarks of performance by the Palestinians. They should have a right to have a state, but they also have to engage in some performances that demonstrate this is a state that will actually contribute to peace and not be a threat to it.
I mean, let me just.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, you should applaud. That's good. But I will say one thing. I think Dennis is 100% spot on 2 points. One is I think that the importance of the Saudi normalization with Israel is critical, as I mentioned, 100 ways, right? Given it's not just the Saudi, it's the rest of the Muslim world. It's Malaysia, it's Indonesia, it's Qatar, it's Kuwait. It's the rest. That's one, which will dramatically change the Middle East. Number two, for the first time, we have leverage, meaning that the reality of this is that I spent a lot of time with Prime Minister Netanyahu on this topic, as I did with Bennett and Lapid. They want a Saudi deal. If you look at Netanyahu's book that came out a year ago, which I read, if you read the book, in the book it talks about his objectives for two things. One is obviously destroying Iran's nuclear capabilities and normalization with Saudi Arabia. Those are completely linked. And so the reality of this is he wants it desperately, and I believe before October 7th that he would have made that trade, even if he ultimately had to give up his coalition and have a call for elections on the basis of the Saudi deal, okay? So I think those timbers are still quite in his head, thinking about getting that done. But I think it's up to us, the Americans, to work with the Saudis to make sure this is the price to be paid. In the meantime, as we all run around for this idea of a two-state solution, when I was in Israel, and as Dennis knows, I always believe in incrementalism. I know that's not a great, you're not going to get a Nobel Peace Prize for being an incrementalist, but the reality is the little things that get done is what changes the lives of people, both in Israel and in the West Bank. We're not talking about the West Bank right now. We've been talking about Gaza, but just remember, guys, it's a numbers game. There's 9 million people who live in Israel. 7 million are Jews. 2 million are Palestinian Arabs, Druze. They're a melting pot. In the West Bank, there are 3 million Palestinians and 2 million Gazans. So for those of you who can't do math, it's 7 million and 7 million. The Jews aren't going anywhere, nor are the Arabs. So we need to figure this out. In the meantime, we can put pressure on the government, the Israeli government, which both Democrats and Republicans have struggled with, about settlement growth in the West Bank, on more ability for Palestinians to work in Israel. Before the war, 160,000 Palestinians worked every day in Tel Aviv and in Jerusalem and across Israel. That number's down to 500 people right now. And if you don't think that has consequences on the economic situation for the Palestinians, we're all mistaken. We can do this, and we need to do these things immediately to change the dynamic. So we will have a two-state solution in our lifetime. It's going to be step by step, but we're going to get there, and we have no choice than to get there.
Dennis, I want to ask you this because it's relevant. You were at a moment in the Clinton administration where it was very close to getting an agreement.
Very close.
I think we have to remember that because we were close to getting it done.
Yeah.
Why did it fail at that time?
Well, one person, Yasser Arafat. We
Arafat.
actually, we had I can tell you, when we presented the Clinton parameters at the end of the administration, we had the Israeli and the Palestinian delegations there. We presented it to them. I only recently learned that the Palestinian delegation among themselves agreed they should accept the Clinton parameters. And they also agreed not to brief back in Ramallah so that they would go back to see Arafat as a collective. And so they would walk in and they'd have strength in numbers. And one of the group, didn't brief details, but just generally let someone know that they were supportive of it. And Arafat was told this, and when the group walked in, before they could say anything, he said, "You're all traitors." And they melted. Now, I mean, this is, in a sense, talk about the tragedy of this conflict. I mean, the reason I know this is because I was having dinner with one of the former Palestinian negotiators who was on the team, and he said to me, lamented plaintively, "Can you imagine where we would be if we had said yes?"
Right.
Amazing. Yeah, amazing. All right, let me ask on the whole issue of Iran and the missile attack that took place. 300 missiles were fired at Israel in what is a pretty blatant attack on Israel. 300 missiles going into from Iran to Israel, because there was a coalition of nations that came together. 90% of those missiles were taken down. That was an amazing effort. Can that coalition of nations be used to help in dealing with better peace in the Middle East?
Look, I think the key for Israel, even before October 7th, was security. Well, now it's even more of a preoccupation. But take a step back and understand what happened. Israel has had an ethos. The ethos was, we defend ourselves by ourselves. We never ask anybody else to fight for us. Well, guess what just happened? On the night of April 13th, suddenly there were others who actually, for the first time, played a role in terms of intercepting what were the ballistic missiles, the cruise missiles, and the drones that were fired at Israel. Israel did not do it only on its own. It was flawless in its own performance. But the truth is, 1/3 of what had to be intercepted was not intercepted by Israel because others did it. So this is not an abstraction. We have spent years putting together an effort to put together a combination of integrated air and missile defense in the region. And we now, under Central Command, we actually see it's real. Now, that is critical from the standpoint of Israel being able to deal with the threats it faces, because it's not just facing Iran by itself, it's facing Iran and all of its proxies. So here is a manifestation that Israel actually has partners, and if it can actually, if we have, this is the point that Tom was getting at, we have a Saudi breakthrough. You suddenly take what is this regional coalition, and now you also have the peace dimension to it, and you have a coalition of those who want a very different future. Iran represents basically turn the clock back, no hope, oppress your publics, ensure that basically you live in a world of no hope and no possibility. This is what they prey upon. And this is all of their proxies. In every state that they're at, they've either created a fail-safe. You look at Lebanon. We haven't talked about Lebanon. Lebanon used to be a country that was basically resilient. 80% of the population today in Lebanon lives under the poverty level. This is because of what Hezbollah has done to Lebanon. If you want a future that looks like Lebanon or Syria or Libya or Yemen or even Iraq, then follow the Iranian model. But if you want a future that looks like what's happening in the Gulf states, where Ani was talking about, when you go there, what are they talking to you about? Yeah, they're talking about space for AI. They're talking about all these new investments. Why did we see the Abraham Accords emerge? It began because of common security threats, but it morphed into something else. You know, Israel's a cutting-edge country when it comes to water security, food security, health security, cybersecurity. These countries saw Israel as a natural partner. Yeah. And in an environment where everybody has a coalition that is countering those who want to turn the clock back, you actually have a prospect for the region that creates a lot of hope, and the Israelis are a part of that.
And
Let me go ahead.
Oh, sorry, I was just going to add the corollary to that is one of the reasons October 7th happened when it did is because Hamas was quite happy to upset the apple cart of normalization in the Middle East.
Yeah, true. Let me turn to some of the other challenges with regards to democracy. China and Taiwan. Obviously, Xi has constantly saying, you know, Taiwan is going to be with China in one way or the other. How closely is Xi watching developments, particularly in Ukraine, in order to determine what happens and what he does in Taiwan?
Yeah, I'm happy to take this one. I think he's watching it very, very closely. I was just in China 2 weeks ago, met with a lot of senior business folks and Communist Party leaders, and Xi Jinping is focused on rebuilding the People's Liberation Army, his military, and he's very closely watching what's happening in Russia from two perspectives. A, how close does the West stick together? And by the way, Todd can talk about this. In Ukraine and Russia, the last 6 months of wobbling notwithstanding, you had the US and Europe holding strongly together. You had mostly, until the last 6 months, Republicans and Democrats holding together. And you had in the United States, the business community and the government holding together. So the lesson Xi Jinping took, oh, these guys are maybe stronger than we think. The second thing he is watching is, oh, my military is based on the Russian model, and it has some Russian equipment. And none of that performed very well in Ukraine. And so I think a lot of the shakeup you're seeing in China they've purged 9 generals in their rocket force, some for corruption, some for others. The defense minister disappeared. A lot of the shakeup you're seeing there is, I think, because Xi Jinping realizes that he doesn't want to have a Russian-style military. I don't know, Todd, if you want to weigh in.
Yeah, Anya, I couldn't agree more, and I think China also takes a look at the activities, for example, on April 13th. This was a coalition, that this was several nations coming together in very quick fashion, achieving some pretty significant results in the 90th percentile as far as the interception of those missiles coming in. And that would not have occurred were it not for the blood, sweat, and tears of the alliance and the partnership that started many, many years ago, specifically on integrated air and missile defense. And as you've noted, Xi pays very close attention to what takes place in Moscow, certainly what takes place in the battle space in Ukraine. But I think more than just about all of that, the unity that NATO still demonstrates that could quite possibly be replicated one day with an ASEAN Plus in the Pacific is something that we're all aspiring to achieve one day. And I just contend that April 13th activity from a coalition perspective was a positive, and it's something that probably didn't make Xi very happy.
And Leanne, one of the things I think, I'm quite nervous over the next 45 days as it relates to Russia and Ukraine. I think it is, as you look at the New York Times and read the New York Times, those of you do, and all the 4 or 5 top stories are all about the Middle East, about Israel, Hamas, and then the 7 stories about how the Russians have just reorganized their military and that they're doing a big offense right now in northern Ukraine. My anxiety here is why the rest of the world is focused on, or at least the media is focused on, the Middle East. The Russians are making this calculation, which is you end where you begin, which is if the more land we take now, if Biden wins or Trump wins, that's where we start our negotiation. And I think there's going to be a massive push. I think there's a determination right now that the Ukrainians are sort of weak, that even though the money has been appropriated by the U.S. Congress and NATO, it takes time to get those missiles and those operations onto the ground, as you know. So I'm very focused and very worried about the next couple months during the summer months about the offense that the Russians may try to pull off here.
If I could add.
Yeah, do
Sorry.
you share that concern, Todd?
I do. I don't know if I'm quite as alarmed as you are,
Good.
but
Good, you know more than I do.
He's fighting that war.
We all know that since February of 2022, this campaign has taken many shapes, forms, and fashions. Its resolution is probably later rather than sooner. And I contend if there is a Russian offensive and there is an advantage that takes place over the course of the next several weeks, it won't be strategic enough to turn the tide of the entire campaign. But it could be something that is a significant setback for a long period of time. Given that we have pretty good situational awareness on what has been gifted so far, and from a comprehensive all-domain military approach, I'm convinced that we can recover from the loss of goods going in for a short period of time, and be in a position to where the support is there to where we can get back with a little bit of positive military campaign momentum on the Ukrainian side. But it's all a later activity as opposed to sooner.
I think that conflict, Russia-Ukraine, is essentially, it's two conflicting timelines. One is how fast can the West get the military kit to Ukraine, and how effectively can the Ukrainians use it? And by the way, they've just conscripted 50,000 more people. How fast can they train them? The other side of that timeline is Russia is throwing young, not very well-trained recruits at this. They are mostly from the provinces. We should all feel sorry for them. They're not. Russia's whole economy is on a war footing in a way that we don't hear about as much. Probably 40% of their budget, by some estimates, is now going to the military. Now, that's killing Russia in the long run, but in the short run, that means that war machine is cranking up. There are a lot of dual-use items now going from China into Russia to support that war machine. Russia has 3 times the people and 9 times the economy of Ukraine. So the Ukrainians need to fight now and fight fast, and we need to get them the kit quickly, which is why that I'm very glad that our Congress finally did the right thing.
You know, one of the concerns I always thought,
Applaud the Congress, applaud the Speaker.
one of the things I always thought was potentially a constraint on Putin, because he always in the past showed a great sensitivity to taking any casualties. In fact, they tried to disguise them. But the irony that we've seen is that by taking people from the provinces, by taking people out of the jails, by, in a sense, using human hordes, really human fodder, he's been able to swamp the Ukrainians, at least along the front, in a war of attrition. He understands they have all the advantages that Yanya was just talking about, and the problem is not just him. The problem is that the war generally is not imposing a cost on the public in Russia. Yeah. Those who come from the provinces don't affect politically the realities in Moscow. He's not feeling a price. The only thing that can bring this war to an end is if the Ukrainians are able to take advantage of what has now been voted them but hasn't yet been provided them, to raise the cost to the point where Putin understands, okay, now the cost has become too high and I have an interest in looking for a way out. He's not there.
Let me ask, Tom, there has obviously been a growing wave of anti-Semitism around the country that people are concerned about. What's causing this wave of anti-Semitism, and you know, how concerned are you?
Oh, I'm concerned, and it really has it's come out basically out of the college campuses. You know, if you look at the numbers, you know, those under 30, obviously it's been incentivized by the press, and given the fact that most of our kids and grandkids, I don't have grandkids by the way yet, but kids are I wish I had grandkids, but that's a whole issue. But
If anyone's listening,
if anyone's listening, like yeah. But I think it is. I think the reality of this is because these kids are seeing all of their news by TikTok, and the news on the TikTok is so bad and so one-sided and so destructive. And I think what's happening here is that you can. What I've tried to tell people, you can be anti-Netanyahu. It's okay. You might even be anti-Israel. I don't like it. But be clear, being anti-Semitic is a whole different game. And somehow the idea that you're anti-Zionism, which means you can be anti-Semitic. This is the fight that we have to have, and we have to have the fight with the kids today, and we're going to have to fight this on the college campuses, and we're going to have to educate people, and we cannot give this up. I've spent an enormous time on this in trying to explain to these kids about the importance. When you use language from the river to the sea, many of these kids have no idea what the river is or the sea is. I don't mean that disrespectfully. Because they're into the movement, and I respect people who, as you point out, are protesting out there. If they want to protest, I'm totally happy with it. That's fine. But if you decide that you're going to be an anti-Semite, we're going to get you. And this we cannot have, and we got to be careful that this isn't spread in a way that it goes beyond the college campuses, and we have to work once this war is over to repair the damage that has been done.
Look, there is just on this one last point on this. Just to amplify what Tom was saying, the issue here frequently is Jews are singled out. That's what is going on. On the campuses in particular, you have Jewish students who then get singled out. They don't even know what their attitudes are, but they're Jewish, and so they're excluded. Now, when you start singling out Jews, not only is that anti-Semitic, it opens the floodgates to all sorts of other discrimination.
We're in the last minute here. I want to just ask each of you, are you hopeful about where this country is right now or concerned? Just give me a quick answer.
Okay. I'll give you the 15 seconds. I'm concerned for the near future, and that's why it's important to have people like you, people in the audience, people who care about nuance. But this country has been through so far worse. We've been through World War II, through the Great Depression, through the upheavals of the 1960s. Okay. We're going to get through this.
That's it. Tom?
Hopeful, because you're here. You showed up. Okay, Dennis? You showed up. You want to get in the game. I'm hopeful.
Dennis?
I was going to say "Oy" to begin with, but but after I hear my two colleagues, what can I say? I'm hopeful.
No, you can't say no.
Todd?
I'm hopeful. We still have the greatest people on planet Earth, as evidenced by this crowd and the crowd that we talked to earlier.
Yeah. Well, I'm hopeful because of all four of you and the presentation you've made to this audience. I really believe that in our democracy, the more we're willing to discuss these issues, the more we're willing to learn from others, the more we're willing to think about the critical challenges that we face in our democracy, the better our democracy will be for that. And so we hope the Panetta Lecture Series is contributing to something that's very important to our democracy. If you'll join me in thanking our speakers, and thank you for being here.